Okay, welcome to this remote meeting of the decision session of the Executive Member for Finance and Performance on Thursday, the 12th of November. This meeting is being held in consultation with my colleague, Councillor Andrew Waller, who is the Executive Member for Economy and Strategic Planning. I will start with item 1 on the agenda, declarations of interests. I do not have any declarations. Does Councillor Waller?
Not that aren't already on the council list.
Which brings us to item 2 on the agenda, which is public participation. We have 2 members of the public registered to speak today. You will have roughly 3 minutes. I'll have a certain amount of leeway as we have 1 agenda item and 2 speakers. The first speaker we have registered is a Mr. Martin Spencer. I'd like to invite you now, Mr. Spencer. You will have 3 minutes.
Thank you. We support the text of the background information to agenda item number 3 and welcome its focus upon all York-based businesses. It is great to see in point 22 that all businesses that have premises in York would now be eligible, as this would cover the many local traders who trade in York but do not live in York. We assume that this would also cover those who fail to get financial support through the SEISS scheme, though this seems not to be specified, and so we'd like to urge that this should be both included and clearly expressed in any future wording. The final sentence of point 17 is more worrying, as it appears to say that only 125 York businesses would qualify for assistance under Tier 3 restrictions. Many local retail and hospitality businesses have struggled severely, with turnover dropping massively during Tier 2 restrictions. The fact that they are not closed does not mean that they aren't losing money hand over fist when trade is nowhere near normal and sustainable levels. So, we would strongly suggest that local business groups should be consulted to gauge whether additional support could be crucial in this instance also. Once again, we would like to offer our help and support to CYC as they work to identify all York-based businesses who would qualify for grants under the ARG proposals. And we are grateful for the efforts made by CYC to track down and log cases where local businesses were not able to claim microgrants the first time around. Total cooperation now will avoid the prospect of local business folk missing out once again, with no further grant assistance likely until April 2022. Representatives for independent traders will work together to ensure that none of York's unique and irreplaceable businesses fall through the cracks a second time. It is truly vital that we do so, because the prospect of losing much of the social fabric of our city centre is at stake here, along with the financial survival of tons of hard-working local people. But the positive potential remains, and by working together, we can protect the maximum number of those businesses and the rich and diverse offering that is essential for York. In doing so, we will preserve the enduring appeal of York so that we can first recover and ultimately thrive in our shared future. So please do get in touch with us if we can assist you in any way. We are here to help in any way that we can. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Spencer. And I know we've discussed some of the issues you've raised already, and we'll look to address some of those as we have the introduction and discussion to the agenda item. Our second speaker is Kevin Toohey. Mr. Toohey, again, you will have approximately 3 minutes to address us.
Thank you. I'd just like to echo everything that my good colleague Martin has just said. The self-employed market traders, we're facing a crisis. We rely on these months now where traditionally we do make a surplus. It's now gone, and I wonder, as we all do, how many will survive. We urgently need help in terms of things like buying stock, paying rents, feeding our families. I mean, traditionally January and February would be the leaner months. They would see anything upwards of 50%, 60% drop in sales, which is natural. But the reality is that market traders do make their surplus now, and that could be, personally speaking, anything up to like maybe 30, 40% more than what I would normally take in, say, an August month. And then that would take us through the leaner times. It's not the best business model, but it's what most traders work with and work to. That's the reality of the situation. It was interesting to hear Julian Sturdy MP yesterday in the House of Commons refer to shuttered high streets. And that is a very worrying concept to behold. And we are, hopefully a flourishing market before the crisis. If we could return to that, surely that would help in terms of the high street too. Surely a flourishing market and a lively high street go hand in hand. And so I would hope that we are included in the kind of bigger picture, as it were, that we're not treated as a separate entity, but that we are in the same dilemma as to what Mr. Sturdy referred to yesterday. We don't want to be forced to sign on, but what other choice is there if we can't be helped? As I say, we're not a separate entity. We're part of the workforce. We help drive the city. We contribute to the local economy. I mean, there were countless traders who don't use out-of-town outlets. They would rather go to such wonderful establishments as Barnett's and go in to buy one item, then come out with 3 items. That's the nature of what we are in terms of the city centre. We do invest our hard-earned money back into the local economy. We don't like asking for help. We are proud, but in times of desperation, sometimes we do, like everybody else in the country, we need extra help too. As I said before, we don't want to be treated as a separate entity. We are all in it together, and hopefully as Martin said, we can hopefully dig ourselves out in conjunction with the rest of the workforce in York. Any financial assistance that you could give the market traders of York would go a long way, and they'll be totally appreciative of it. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Mr. Tyrion. And again, your comments will be noted and hopefully addressed through some of the comments, both by officers and members, as we go through to the substantive agenda item. So at that point, I'll go on to the main agenda item for today, which is item number 3, which is the lockdown and Tier 3 additional restrictions. I forgot to check, is it you, Simon, or David that's introducing? Simon, over to you, Simon.
Thank you very much indeed, Councillor Eyre, and thank you for the contributions from those who've spoken at the beginning of this meeting as well. The paper you have in front of you sets out the additional restrictions grant funding, which has been allocated to York, a total of £4.212360 million, worked out on the basis of £20 per head. This, if anyone is wondering where it came from, is the money that, for instance, Mayor Burnham in Manchester was discussing with Boris Johnson as they went into Tier 3. It's our equivalent of that funding. The money is to last us right through to the end of the pandemic, which, of course, at this stage is unclear when it will be, and all needs to be spent by the end of next financial year, which perhaps give a bit of insight into thinking behind this in government. So we need to be very mindful of that as we begin to think how that money might be distributed. We're in a strong position in York in terms of getting grant money out that's been provided by government. Earlier in this year, my colleague David Walker and team and myself delivered over £100 million of support to businesses. While there was some concern in York early on that actually we were behind the curve, it quickly became clear that actually York was very much at the top of the league table in terms of getting that money out quickly and getting it out to as many businesses as possible. And that principle continues to underpin our approach to thinking about ARG and indeed the other mandatory grants which are outside of the scope of this paper, but will actually help many more businesses in York through the local restrictions grant closed and such like. But to focus on the 4.2 million that we are considering this morning, we need to be mindful of the advice from government in terms of who they would like it to help. The restrictions at the moment, as we're in this current lockdown, are not the same as the restrictions right at the beginning of lockdown back in March. There are a whole series of businesses which are continuing to be open, which in March felt that they had to close, and we need to remember that. But the table at paragraph 15 tries to show those categories of business which have been told by government that they must shut. Those are those marked in red in that table under the lockdown column, and you'll see it goes from non-essential retail, hospitality venues, right through to places of worship. covering in between personal care and also personal care offered in individuals' homes. And this offers, again, a clue into what the government is hoping this money will support. What they've said is that they hope that it will support businesses which, while not legally forced to close, are nonetheless severely impacted by the restrictions, such as the supply chain for retail, hospitality and leisure, and businesses in the event sector, and also businesses outside of the scope of the business rate system, which are forced to close. And that means businesses which are trading in those sectors marked in red in that table, but not doing so from premises where they pay the rates themselves, or perhaps where rates are attracted. So again, that gives us some pointers in terms of where we need to focus the money. Our experience earlier in the year in terms of our microgrant scheme gave us a lot of insight into some of those businesses that were outside the scope, for instance, of that self-employment income support scheme in terms of the self-employed, and also other businesses which weren't covered by the rates related grants earlier on. We are able to see, for instance, that around 250 businesses in personal care sector applied to us for grants at this stage, and we're able to use those numbers to begin to forecast what we might need to be doing at this stage. Now, the current lockdown is for 1 month. But as I've said, the money actually is potentially to last us for 18 months and indeed for any future lockdown. So we need to be mindful that we may need to repeat this exercise we're going through in November, perhaps on as many as 2 further occasions. And we've factored that into our thoughts around the scale of grants. So the scope we are suggesting is for let's begin with those businesses that aren't forced to close but are in rateable premises and are in the supply chain to businesses which have to close. So, for instance, fishmongers and greengrocers that supply predominantly to hospitality businesses that are now shut. What we're going to offer them, if they can demonstrate that 3/4 of their business is normally in the supply chain and that they're in the rateable premises, they would get the same grants that are about to be delivered in terms of the local restriction grant closed. That's to say, for businesses with a rateable value of 15,000 a year or under, grants at £667 per 2 weeks. For those between 15 and 51,000 rateable value, £1,000 for every 2 weeks, and for those with a rateable value over 51,000, £1,500 for per 2 weeks. Outside of the ratings system, we're proposing 2 levels of payment for businesses that can show that they are in the sectors that have been forced to close and are unable to trade, or indeed can show that their trade has been severely restricted by other businesses that are shut. We're offering for those that have got fixed premises costs, although clearly that they won't be the rate payers, they will be paying rent and they'll have permanent premises that attract costs. We are proposing the lower of those 3 rates, the lowest of those 3 rates in terms of the closed grant. So that would be that £660 per 2 weeks, or £1,334 per 28-day qualifying restriction period. As we've said in the paper, this is adopting the language that the government have put into their advice. And for those that don't have fixed premises costs, and for instance, the market traders we've heard earlier on, this might affect some of them, would attract a payment of £500 per 28-day qualifying period. It's impossible to know actually at this stage exactly how much that might result in terms of claims. But as I say, we can use what we learned earlier on in the year to give us some indication, and our best estimate is that would result in about £1 million of expenditure on a grant scheme as outlined there within a 28-day period. So that would allow us to be able to offer those grants perhaps on for 3 months or on 3 different occasions, and would ensure that if we go down into lockdown again in the new year, we are not going to be in the position where we're unable to offer anybody any assistance because all the money has gone. We may emerge from lockdown into tier 3. I don't think there's much indication of that in terms of our public health numbers at the moment, but we need to be mindful of that because this grant money would also need to cover those conditions. My estimate for how many businesses might be within scope, as I've said, is 125, and that's the figure that one of the speakers alluded to earlier on. That would be essentially for business in tier 3. It's accommodation, leisure and entertainment venues that have to shut. Non-essential retail is allowed to continue, as indeed are personal care and such like. So that's why the scope is less, and that's why I've suggested that there might be fewer businesses eligible, though of course we would commit to paying all of those who can make a strong case that they are covered by, although they're seriously impacted by tier 3, and we very much hope that is not a situation that York is ever going to be in. So in terms of the grants, we're suggesting that 3.5 million of the funding might be allocated as laid out in paragraph 26. Beyond direct grants of money to businesses, we're also encouraged by the guidance to think about how we might help in other ways, but still direct ways to support businesses. And I've sketched out in this report, although it is early thoughts, ones that have been shared with our colleagues in the business networks and to which they've responded well to, but early thoughts in terms of how we might establish what is described as a voucher scheme to provide advice and support to help businesses think about how they might re-emerge into a trading York, and indeed what they might need to do to think about perhaps how they strengthen their online offer, or find other ways to reach new clients and markets. Supporting that kind of innovation, and in a way which potentially enables York businesses to be the businesses that are supporting other York businesses in that, I think is a very key principle in terms of how we try to do local economic development in York and maximise the benefits of such grant schemes. So we are asking for support in developing a more detailed version of that scheme and bringing that back to a future decision session. We're also able to spend money in less direct ways, and the work we did over the summer in terms of supporting reopening, thinking about, for instance, events and how we encourage people into the city centre will surely be a key a priority in the future as well. And again, the money that we have in terms of the additional restrictions grant is the only money that we're going to receive from government. So we are suggesting that we keep a modest amount of that back, 200,000, to support where we need to get to in terms of final reopening. That notional budget allocation at paragraph 26 will of course need to be reviewed in the light, first of all, in terms of how many applications we actually get over the next month to ARG, and whether that £1 million estimate, how accurate that is. And also in terms of the emerging public health situation and the COVID pandemic, for instance, recent news around vaccines and a lot of hope around there at what that means. We'll see how that actually develops in the months ahead, and in keeping some of the a significant proportion of that money back, we will retain flexibility to develop as that situation progresses, and we propose to bring back further reports to your decision sessions and those of the executive member for economy and strategic planning to reconsider as the situation progresses, but adopting the principles that we allowed set out earlier on in the report at paragraph 14 to provide support to as many local businesses as are eligible, and respond flexibly to changing circumstances, make sure that we are truly benefiting the local economy, and that what we're doing has got the very much got the broad support of business communities, which I'm pleased to be able to report back. What we set out in the paper to you today very much does have that support. We will continue to work strongly with our colleagues in the Federation of Small Businesses, in the Chamber of Commerce, in the Institute of Directors, in Make It York, and in York Business Improvement District, as well as talking to more specialised interest groups such as the Market Traders, the Retail Forum, the Hospitality Association, and many others. So I hope that sets out what we are proposing to you. And we have made recommendations there in terms of what you might ask the Chief Operating Officer to implement as an emergency decision in terms of setting out the grants that we've put before you, asking me to go away and come back with more detail around how a voucher scheme might work, and thinking about how we might allocate that £200,000 budget for events, as well as reviewing the process and allocations as we get further information by running the scheme. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. I'll just check, David, is there anything you wanted to add before I...
No, thank you. Nothing else I want to add to that. Thank you.
No problem. Okay, in which case I'll open up to discussion. Councillor Waller.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to thank officers for preparing this report. I think it's important to have visibility. Appreciate that time is of the essence, and other councils haven't done this. And I think it's testament to the work that's been put in to inform and engage with businesses to ensure that the maximum effective use of limited resources provided by government can be fully utilised. We have been making the case to government for companies that missed out in previous grants, and I'm grateful for the work that officers put in to gathering information from companies so that we could put that together in lobbying letters direct to ministers and also through the Local Government Association. I think the real-time experience of the impact of Tier 2 was an example of where it was helpful to have good lines of communication with businesses that, even though they weren't required to close, the chilling effect on footfall of being designated in Tier 2 had a very clear impact on the viability of businesses. There have been some changes. Government has listened. So the £51,000 rateable value barrier to support has gone, and that's something that we did argue as a council on behalf of local businesses for that to happen. Also, the supply chain, that there were many companies not included in previous government schemes the way that they were drawn up, accepting that some things were done very rapidly, but nevertheless they were suffering loss of trade, but were cut out of previous schemes. So that's as a consequence of lobbying by City of York Council and others in making that case. And there are other anomalies that were ironed out. I take on board the comments from the two speakers that, as with other businesses, having these 4 weeks in the run up to Christmas cut out of their trading is a significant and is more than 1 month's worth of profit to keep the businesses going during the lean time. So we recognise that, and there would be an impact if we did emerge into Tier 3, that the way the rules are written, there would be limited support to businesses. So it's far more important that we come out in a much lower tier to ensure the viability and in the run up to Christmas. The money, it is interesting that they are looking longer term to the 18 months, so therefore there's a more recovery phase aspect of this, but it's important to keep businesses viable in the meantime. And so the real-time provision of information and factual, transparent and informative detail that we can use with partners to lobby for support and to guide delivery of limited resources and policies, I think that's really important. And I think it's been important to work with partners. Simon mentioned the FSB, Make It York, the BID, Institute of Directors and Chamber of Commerce, and there has been real collaboration in gathering the information and making sure that we're making best use of what is a finite pot. The previous schemes have been fully distributed, and it's testimony to the staff and their diligence in making sure that was done, recognising that all of this is audited, and therefore there has to be checks and balances put in place, but I accept the way in which staff have gone above and beyond in order to make sure that there was prompt payment to businesses that really needed it. I think looking slightly longer term, we don't know what Christmas will bring. The evidence coming across the pond is that with the Canadian Thanksgiving being in October, there was an uptick following that. So I think it is beholden upon us all to continue to do what we can to minimize the spread of COVID in anticipation of a hopeful rollout of vaccine, but we don't know precisely when that will occur, and therefore it is important that we don't let our guard down. The funding that's been allocated, well, that will be allocated by officer decision, detailed in paragraph 26, it's worth bearing in mind this is across all sectors, so there will be many businesses out there who will be relying on this as a means of supporting them. So it's across all sectors, it's across businesses outside the city walls as much as inside the city walls, and we do hear a lot about the city centre, but we shouldn't lose sight of those businesses that provide employment, and also the self-employed micro businesses that we identified as missing out very early on in the process, and those are significant sources of employment within the city that we need to keep going. So I think that this approach has very quickly provided a solution which ensures as maximum use of the resources as permitted, and I think has engaged very comprehensively with the rest of the city. So those would be my comments, Councillor Eyre.
Thank you, Councillor Waller. Tracy?
I think we've covered the subject matter of this report quite comprehensively in those comments. I think just one thing to add is that before we went into Tier 2 lockdown, we had allocated £100,000 as a tourism marketing budget to try and drive footfall back into the city. We obviously put our foot on the ball on that spend as we went into increased restrictions. But as we start to prepare for coming out of this lockdown, and with the obvious caveat that we don't know what we will emerge into, we are continuing to look at how we encourage residents to use their local shops and eateries, and how we then try and drive increased footfall as we start to emerge from this wave. We are trying to do that in a fairly managed way so that we are not encouraging excessive use of the city, which might then in fact impact on infection rates. But it is really important to try and certainly with our own York residents, to try and get them to use their local shops, to use the independents, and spend the York pound in York. So we continue to look at ways in which we'll use that marketing spend to do that.
Thank you, Tracy. I think from my point of view, most points have been covered by both Simon and Councillor Waller. I think the one thing I would reflect on is the huge amount of work that's gone on in the past few days, in the past few weeks in terms of officers. Very short period of time to get this turned around from when it was first announced to when we first got the details. And I think it's a high pressure situation, as well as the short length of time and speed that needs to be happening. This is people's livelihoods and business livelihoods, and it's very difficult work and done under very stressful circumstances in a very short space of time. And I think it's commendable that we've been able to get something not only produced in this speed, but also out into the public. So we've actually been able to get some public feedback from that one. I think if we're honest, we have to acknowledge we probably won't get it 100% right straight away with the timeframes that we've got. And I think one of the benefits we have is the huge amounts of expertise that we've got and the connections that we've got across the city. And I think we were one of the leading local authorities in the country in terms of recognising from March the gaps that were there in the system and those businesses that were falling through. We acted swiftly to put the £1.2 million into the system to try and address those gaps. And I think through that, we've built connections and actually got a lot of expertise and confidence about knowing what our sector is and knowing where some of the areas are. And that probably has put us in a better situation than some local authorities have become to this situation. We've got the bare bones of what companies will need that, a lot of the supply chain issues that we've got. But I think the third bullet point of the recommendations is key to me, that the fact that it will require reviewing and will require review points. as we go through, be that at the end of this lockdown period or going forward. And I know both Simon and Councillor Waller have very extensive contacts and communications with the sector and the community and business community at large. And those will be absolutely vital as we go forward, and having some level of flexibility to be able to adapt the system and grow it in terms of some of the information we're finding and some of the gaps that we've done our best to try and address, but perhaps haven't possibly had quite the knowledge and expertise to get into some of those areas. So I think with that point, I'm happy to agree the recommendations at paragraph 3 at the bottom of pages 1 and page 2 if Councillor Waller is in agreement.
In agreement.
I think to note so that we're recommending that due to the urgency, the Chief Operating Officer will take the decisions as outlined in this report. Okay, with that brings it to agenda item 4 on the agenda, urgent business. I have no urgent business, therefore I'm happy to declare the meeting closed. Thank you everyone for your time, and thank you to the public speakers.